Last class we talked about we talked about distance measures for reconstructing phylogenies. Basically, we talked about where you're given as input a matrix, a species by species matrix of distances, maybe measured in terms of how many millions of years ago they evolved, maybe measured in terms of how many mutations have accumulated, or something like that. Okay, and then tried to come up with the quote-unquote right tree that explained these distances. And in particular, we showed two kinds of distance matrices where it made sense. One is if the distance was in ultrametric trees. Okay, all the distances were in millions of years ago. One in where they were, we said that there was going to be an additive unrooted tree. In both cases, we showed that there was a unique tree to reconstruct, okay, which in principle rested on this ultrametric tree reconstruction algorithm, which was very simple, okay? And everything was great except for the fact that they're not very resilient in the face of errors or inconsistencies in the data, okay? But that gave us at least some model of reconstruction under distances. Any questions about any of that? So let me show you another class of distance reconstruction, of tree reconstruction problems, which is from a completely different class of tree reconstruction data. In fact, actually today, this week I met in my office with a professor from, the anatomy department who studies the evolution of whales, okay? And she is not a distance-based phylogeny person. She is a feature-based phylogeny person. So what does that mean exactly? Instead of, what she is going to do is, instead of starting out with a species-to-species distance, she's going to build a table of features, okay, where she has a set of species from 1 to n, and then a set of features, okay, that she unearths. She may look at fossils, okay, and maybe based on fossils there will be certain features you can learn from looking at the fossil skeleton. How many legs does it have? Does it fly? How big is it? How small is it? And so she has as input we'll basically study fossils and build a matrix where the rows are species and the columns are features. Okay? And a feature might be like, does it fly? For most whales, the answer is no. Okay, so it will come out to be 0, 0, 0. But maybe there's one special whale that knows how to fly, right? There may be a feature of, does it swim? Okay, and again, most of the whales probably swim. The flying one happens to also swim. Okay? You can start to ask them, what do I don't know too much about whales, but for example, they have rudimentary legs. Whales evolved from mammals that actually were land mammals. Okay? So you can certainly imagine, does the species have a rudimentary leg bones that they have found, right? And some of them will and some of them won't. Okay? And what other features of whales do they have? I guess whales, there's toothed whales, right? Like sperm whales, I know, have teeth, right? And blue whales and other things have these baleen things to suck food up. Okay? Those of you who watch enough wildlife television know what I'm talking about, right? So you have, does the whale have teeth? Some whales have teeth. Some whales don't have teeth, right? Which whales have baleen to eat with? Some of them, the toothed whales, don't. Some of the other ones probably use baleen to eat, okay? Maybe the flying whale has a third, has some combination, has gums as food, okay? So you can imagine a world where you've now got a matrix of features and species. And the question is now reconstruct the evolutionary order, okay, of whether or not, of a tree that will describe how these features evolved, okay? Any questions about that? That's kind of what the goal here is. Yeah?
Does it also include the level to which the feature is enabled? For example, ostrich has the rest of it can fly, right?
Okay. So if we were talking about birds, an ostrich would have the property that it has feathers. Okay? Flight would be no. So certainly you could give these as features. And again, every species either has it or doesn't, right? A bat flies, okay, but it doesn't have feathers, right? Yes? So in this case, right now, okay, we're going to talk about it as a binary vector. But in principle, you could imagine that certain features have multiple properties to them. Like, like let's say you could imagine, what's a feature that would be a three-letter? What? Eye color. Okay, if let's say eye color was a property that there are multiple different kinds of eye colors, not too many of them. And we could imagine, let's say there's blue-eyed whales, there's green-eyed whales, okay? There's red-eyed whales, okay? Perhaps that's a feature that matters.
Couldn't you just have them as separate features?
Or you could maybe make those by the same issue that we came up with before when we were talking about classifying. How do you represent it? For now, let's say we'll talk about binary features, okay? In fact, we're even going to talk about a very special kind of binary feature where it's something where, the ancestral species is assumed to have nothing, and that a feature is something you gain as opposed to something you lose, okay? So flying is something that would be a feature you gain unless the ancestral species flew, right? But right now, let's just say 0 means you don't have something. 1 is a feature that you gained, okay? But of course, in general, we can talk about multiple, more than binary features. And we can talk about ones where they're not necessarily ordered. That let's say, what the original state was and what it is now. We do know that everything came from some microbe. The microbe didn't fly. The microbe didn't walk, okay? And so at the beginning, it had none of these properties, right? But now we have a species that do have these properties. How did the features evolve? Any questions?
So these ones that you put are specific for that particular feature.
Right, so a 1 here means that species, a 1 here in row I, column J, means that species I has feature J.
And it's not that its parent didn't have it and it has it.
We don't know anything about what its parent does or does not have. We're trying to figure out species. I have a stuffed whale in a museum, okay? Or maybe an existing type of whale. There are lots of kinds of whales, okay? You look at a whale in an aquarium, and you're looking, it says, yes, it swims, doesn't fly, okay? If you looked at a skeleton, you would know whether or not it had an ancestral legs, things like this. Open its mouth, does it have teeth? The question really is now, how would we try to figure out the evolution of the species? Okay, the origin of the species given the features. And the key idea here is this only makes sense if we assume that these features have the property that they are hard to evolve. Okay? Namely, imagine we live in a world where each of these features is so complicated that you can only imagine natural selection inventing it once. Okay? And if so, what does that mean? If it was hard to invent teeth, okay, then any whale that has, all the whales that have teeth have to sit together with a common ancestor in the tree. Does that kind of make sense? That there's got to be a point in history where the first whale with teeth evolved, okay? And all other teethed whales have to be a descendant of it. Does everybody get that idea? When we talk about perfect phylogeny, we are talking about a very special case where we're going to assume that each of these features only evolved once. And the question is, can we find a tree where, explaining all these species, where only each feature evolved once? Okay, that is what we mean by the perfect phylogeny problem. Does that make sense? Any questions? Okay. So we're going to ask ourselves, look at this algorithmic problem. Right now, there should already be perhaps some questions as to how realistic this model is, right? If features evolve more than once, okay, that wouldn't be picked up by this model immediately, right? So you have to be pretty careful in selecting your features to have features that evolve once or are hard to evolve, okay? And that's actually a tricky thing, like something like flight. okay, which always seemed to me to be a pretty good trick, right? It seems to have evolved separately from, mammals fly, okay, and bats fly, and they presumably split off from mice, something like this, some kind of a rodent, okay. Insects fly, birds fly, okay. All of these were probably separate reinventions, okay. So there's a certain amount of trick here, but certainly we can imagine it makes sense. Given one of these matrices, try to find the most evolutionarily efficient way to evolve these features, okay? And that is what we mean by a parsimony-based thing. Parsimony is a word for what? Does anyone know what the word parsimony means? Stingy, cheap, right? Oh, he's very parsimonious means, he'll let you pick up the check, right, if you eat with him, right? And likewise, we want something where it is the most efficient way for evolution to have constructed all of these features. That's kind of what the idea is behind parsimony. Any questions? Yes?
When you say that there could be problems in the model, so when you get the result, how sure you are that the results are?
Okay, so the question is, how sure are you of the results of an experiment like this? So again, if you sort of say, here's a bunch of features, okay, here's a bunch of species, here's a feature table. I construct a tree that explains these features pretty well. How do I know this is the absolute best tree? The answer, of course, is you don't know, okay, on some level. That's why these phylogenists fight with each other a lot, right? But basically the goal is you put as good evidence into the analysis that you can. The argument, it makes sense that evolution is going to, that features are hard to evolve. So an explanation that minimizes the number of reinventions of things is a good tree. It's an interesting tree, okay? How do you know that this is the best way to do it? We don't know anything, I guess, is the way I would put it. But if you want an explanation, this seems like a great place to start, right? And I think the weight is now on somebody else to argue why is this this tree wrong? Does that answer your question? I think that's basically that's comfortable with me. Yeah.
Different features have different weights. Some of them might be really hard. Some of them might.
Okay, so what you're saying is that in fact it might be that certain species have certain weights. Okay, as you say, certain features. So that might be hard to evolve. Flight doesn't seem to be so hard to evolve. Okay, but maybe eyes. Eyes are a classic example of something that seems like it's a very hard thing to evolve. But on the other hand, there seems to be a lot of independent reinvention of eyes also. Okay, so I'm not sure. So the answer is maybe you could do that. Okay, we agree that's a generalization of the algorithm, right? So let's just talk about here about the basic case where we want to explain all the features, okay, where they're reinvented once. Okay, recognizing that anything you do to make the problem more general can only make it more harder, but the simplest version should give us some insight into how we might do that. Okay, any questions about that? So here's an example of a perfect phylogeny tree. We have here a set of 5 species. Those are the rows. The species are the leaf nodes. We have here 5 features. It doesn't have to be a square matrix. It happens we have 5 features. Okay? And the claim is that this phylogeny, a perfect phylogeny, is an edge-labeled rooted tree. Okay? Where what is going to happen here? If we look at this thing, in this particular tree, the fact that this is the moment, somewhere in this time before the split happened, feature 3 evolved. That means that D and B have to have feature 3, B and D, and nothing else can have it, right? Only things below that edge can have that feature, right? If we look at this particular split point, somewhere along here feature 2 evolved, somewhere along here feature 1 evolved. A and C are the only ones that can have 2 and 1. A and C have, A has 2 and 1, C has 2 and 1. Okay, C has another feature 5 which evolved after the split off from A. Does that kind of make sense? So our goal here is to construct a, what you call it, an edge-rooted tree to explain the origin of all the features, okay? Where each feature appears as exactly one label, right? Okay, as a label of one edge. That was the invention of it, okay? Any questions about that? No? Yeah.
This tree it says that if a species have feature tree, what that feature should do that.
So the question is, suppose we didn't know about feature 3, okay? Now there is no feature 3. My question is, would this tree still be the only explanation of what is going on? I actually claim it does. Does everybody agree with that? It's still the case that B is the only one that doesn't have any features now, right? Okay? So if you look at this thing, not all features, some features are redundant. That's the first observation to note. Okay? So it is possible that certain features are redundant. That's what this is trying to explain. And that's obviously particularly true when the number of features is greater than the number of species. You can imagine that if you're a real whale expert, you can probably find 100 things about whales that excite you, okay, that are different features. But maybe you only know there's only 30 types of whales, right? Okay? So the important thing, as far as we're concerned, it's an edge-labeled tree, and we're trying to explain the origin of the features, okay? This is actually kind of more interesting, in fact, than just necessarily evolutionary. You know, we had a distance-based tree. This is arguably a more interesting tree, right? It not only says where the species came about, but it tells you something about what the guys at the intermediate nodes looked like, right? We don't know what these guys looked like, but we do know that they had feature 2, right? That's arguably, you know, it's interesting to know when these features evolved, right? Did whales evolve, lose their legs before or after they developed baleen, okay? Maybe there was a type of whales that walked on land and swished things through the baleen, or not, right? But in principle, this is the kind of thing you might uncover with this kind of analysis. Any questions? Okay. Any questions about the model or the problem? Yes. Anything? Yes.
No, I still don't understand. What if there is a feature which everyone has?
If there's a feature that everyone has, what would that be like? Well, the right way to think about it is, a feature that everyone has, there must have been an ancestor to this thing, okay, that evolved it back then, right? So by this model, where we're saying features have to strictly evolve, right? Maybe there's a feature 0, which is warm-blooded, right? All whales are warm-blooded. But somehow that evolved before we started seeing the differentiation into whale species, right? So maybe here we have yeast. This is going to be species Z, or Y for yeast, right? Yeast is not warm-blooded, right? There was a common ancestor over here, right? So a feature that they all had, in principle, evolved before the root, okay? And is not particularly interesting, right? It doesn't tell us anything about the species at hand, yeah?
So the redundancy is with respect to the difference between whales and not like its feature is redundant for the organism.
No, right. So but I say by redundant, the feature being redundant here, it means it does not contribute to a split, okay? It is not necessarily that that each feature describe a change in the population, okay? In this case, whether or not these populations learned to do anything in that period has no bearing on the species tree, right? Okay? But a feature may or may not have evolved in that time. That's what we would hope to recover from the feature-based tree. Any questions about that? Okay? Fair enough. So let's think a little bit about how we might be able to recover feature-based perfect phylogenies, okay, if one exists, okay? And so I claim that in some sense the reconstruction problem of whether or not there is a perfect phylogeny is relatively simple. Suppose we know that all features evolve from 0 to 1. That means that when we talk about it later, that means that the characters are ordered. They go from not having a feature to having a feature. Okay? The claim is that if I give you a feature matrix, there will be a perfect phylogeny if and only if, for every pair of columns, remember were features, the set of ones are either disjoint or one column contains another column. What does it mean for feature 1 and feature 2 to have a disjoint set of species that have it? Right? So here, this species have feature 1, this species has feature 2, and the rest of them are 0. How would that be, those three features be, that property of the tree be explained? Okay, if we have two features, okay, two species have it, one species has another feature, okay? How would that be explained? Right, so there was a branching, okay, feature 1 got evolved here, and if this was S1, 2, and 3, 1 and 2 have to be descendants of that, right? Someplace else there had to be a tree where there was a split where feature 2 evolved, and somewhere underneath here is going to be feature, species 3. Does everybody agree with that? That if the columns are disjoint, the features evolved independently. What's another such possibility? Another possibility might be that the features of one column, species of one column contain the other. Here's feature 1, feature 2. Here's species 1, 2, and 3. Let's say that these species features, only one of these had feature 1. And in this case, there was species 2 and 3 had feature 2. One had both feature 1 and feature 2. This is a case where one column is contained within another column. Does everybody see that? How would these have evolved? What do we know in this case? Feature 2 evolved from feature 1, meaning that the tree that you want to have is that there was a feature labeled 1, a feature labeled 2, right? Underneath feature labeled 2 over here are sitting species. Well, let's look at this thing. Actually, let's look at which evolved. Is this possible? Did feature 1 evolve before feature 2? I claim no. Because if feature 1 evolved before feature 2, how did species 2 come to have feature 2 but not feature 1? Does everybody see that? This is not what's allowed, right? What is the tree that explains it? Okay. If we now have a tree where feature 2 evolved, then feature 1 evolved, right? Now what's going to happen? In this subtree over here would sit species 2, right? And in this subtree over here would sit species 1. And in this subtree over here would sit species 3. Does everybody see that? So if we want to explain the ordered phylogeny here, my claim is that thinking about the key issue basically is that if the columns are if the columns are disjoint, they evolved independently. If one column contains the other one, okay, then if column I contains column J, then the bigger column had to have, the one with the more ones has to have evolved before, evolved before the one with the less species, okay? And if there is a conflict, the claim is there cannot be a phylogeny. What is an example of a 3-species world, 3-species, 2-feature world that could not exist with a perfect phylogeny? Here we've got feature 1, feature 2, species 1, 2, and 3. What kind of a situation couldn't exist? Think 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1. Does everybody see that? This is now the problem where they are not, columns are not disjoint, right? And the claim is that this kind of a world couldn't have evolved. Why? Well, what do we know? I mean, I don't know if it's self-evident if you think about it a little bit. How could this possibly be the case? Well, there had to be somebody evolved species 1. Actually, it looks like then, if we had 1, then 2, okay, then species 3 would be happy. Species 1 would be happy hanging off of here. But species 2 would be unhappy. Does everybody agree with that? The only way you could do it, presumably, would be if you had 1, 2, okay, and then the reinvention of another species. Does everybody see this? Here, under this world, here, species 3 would exist, okay? Species 2 would sit off over here. Species 1 would sit off over here. Right? But the trouble is, you have reinvented feature 1. Okay? Any questions? So if you believe this characterization, then my claim is that the algorithm should be simple to tell whether there exists a phylogeny. Can someone give me an efficient algorithm to tell whether or not there is a perfect phylogeny? Yeah. Right, so basically we're going to compare every pair of features. Are they independent? Okay, then they exist on separate subtrees. Is there a dependency? Well, that means that if I have a, if I have a, okay. If I had a, if I am contained within you, there's somehow an edge from me to you, okay? At least a path in the tree from me to you, okay? And the claim would be that by just comparing all pairs of columns, you could figure out, whether this property holds. If the property holds, there is a perfect phylogeny, okay? And the claim is sort of we could probably figure out the tree this way, right? That's kind of what you're sort of saying. Although I think it's a little hand-wavy. Does anybody have a clean idea how you would build a tree like this? Okay? It's not immediately obvious to me. I mean, it's obvious to me I should be able to do it, right? It's obvious to me I should be able to do it. It's obvious I can check the matrix for this property. If it's true, but I claim that a convincing algorithm that you can do it falls out of our friend, the ultrametric tree. Okay? Let's look at the following idea I claim to actually find the tree that observes this feature matrix. Suppose, let's say, we take our feature matrix, which is what we have here, okay, species by features, and instead from that compute a distance matrix. Not quite a distance matrix, but maybe a similarity matrix that tells me how many features the species have in common. Okay? How many features does A have in common with A? Well, the answer is 2, right? That's not a hard one, right? How many features does A have in common with B? None. Does everybody see that? Okay. How many features does A have in common with C? This is in common, and this is in common. So the answer would be 2. Does everybody see that? Now my claim is, if you give me a perfect phylogeny, we can label the tree with the number of labels we have encountered, number of features we have so far. Let's look at an example. Here we have what I think we have, maybe this, I think this is the same tree as before. Here is a perfect phylogeny tree, right? Does everybody see that? How many features does each node have? At this point, we're back at this point, the world has no features, right? Does everybody see that? These nodes have one feature. This node has two features, 3 and 4, right? This node B has how many features? 1. This node here has one feature. This node here has one feature. Okay. 2 features, 2 features, 3 features. Does everybody see that? What's interesting about these numbers? Okay. If we look at these numbers, what interesting property do these node numbers have? By definition, you're only increasing the number of features you have. Does everybody agree with that? You start out with no features, okay? You can only evolve things through time, right? So what does that mean? That means that the vertex numbers increase monotonically as we go down the tree, right? What was the property of an ultrametric tree? Not the same. What was the property of the ultrametric tree? They decreased like that. How do you go between increasing and decreasing? If I make them negative, okay, suddenly, usually it's not that big an difference, right? If I slap a negative sign on here, now everything is decreasing. Does everybody see that? And once we believe this now, this not only gives us this gives us an algorithm, right? Because the number of features two things have in common is a function of the feature, the species/feature matrix, right? So it should be obvious that we can compute. It's obvious that given this, I can compute that, right? Does everybody see that? See how I computed that? Just a dot product. That's all that I'm doing. Every one of these entries is the dot product of 2 rows, right? And if I make it negative, okay, and negate it, I now have an ultrametric tree reconstruction problem, and I know that I can easily find an ultrametric tree. We talked about that last class. And even more, I know that ultrametric trees are unique, right? So what's interesting is, if there is a perfect phylogeny, we just proved something kind of cool, that there is only one tree that explains it. Okay? Any questions about that? Okay? Yes? Does this take care of reinventions? And the answer is, let's think, first of all, does reinventions have this property? Let's think about that. Okay? So let's think about reinventions. Okay? The short answer is going to be no, because if you have reinventions, the problem's going to turn NP complete. So on a meta level, I can tell you no. But let's think about why that's no. Okay? What is the feature matrix going to look like when we have reinventions? Okay? What?
It'll have intersections for these.
Well, it is clear. Okay, so that's what you mean by reinventions. First of all, there's a question, are you allowed to lose features? If, let's say, you could imagine that things, had legs and lost them, okay, like, for example, whales did, but then you put a whale in Manhattan for long enough, it'll redevelop legs, right? So if you have reinventions, certainly that monotonicity property would be lost, right? But you're asking a more specific problem. What if I am allowed to reinvent things? Okay? Would this be a suitable thing? Let's think about that. So let's just think. That's an interesting question. Think for a minute and then see whether we can get it, because obviously I don't know this. But let's think about it. Okay, yeah.
Wouldn't the reinvention not be obvious from the matrix? I mean, if a species reinvented something and lost.
Oh yes. So first of all, it is not obvious from the matrix whether there's a reinvention. But the question is, suppose there was a reinvention. Okay. It is certainly true we could still compute the dot product, right? It is fair to say that if you only accumulate features, okay, it's still the case that as you move down the tree, the number of features only increases, right? It's not obvious to me that if you have independent reinvention, okay, this is one that's not, it's not obvious to me, but it seems like it's possibly true that if you have reinvention but not removal, okay.
But reinvention would just exist as one again in the.
See, one problem with that, okay, one problem with reinvention, of course, well, no.
By looking at the matrix, they never come to know whether it was reinvented or not. Yeah. I mean, the species will have one in that feature, so.
Well, no, okay. Let's just think. So, I mean, what he's saying, sort of, is suppose, let's say, this probably isn't something to talk about now. But, I mean, what he's saying is you could imagine a world where here there was feature 1 evolved, and also here feature 1 evolved, right? Now, at this point in time, these features evolved separately. You know, there would be this species has it, this feature doesn't, these features also have it, right? Now, one problem with this model is it is indistinguishable from a world where all the features got invented at leaf time. Could you imagine this? You could imagine a group of, you know, you start out with yeast, okay? They separate into communities, separate into communities, separate into communities. And then suddenly in the last 15 minutes, this developed a certain set of features. This developed a certain set of features. If you allow me to reinvent features, I don't believe I can distinguish this explanation from where I just reinvent them at leaf node. Does that make sense? So it's certainly no longer unique, the explanation for it. Okay? And so that, I guess, throws into question the whole issue here. The interesting thing about the perfect phylogeny is that it is unique, okay, and that follows from what we've been doing here, okay. Yes.
By the definition itself, it is parsimonious, so it cannot evolve more than once.
Yeah. So So by this definition, it can't evolve more once. The question was, what if we involve a world where things could evolve more than once?
The question was things can go only from 0 to 1.
Yeah.
In different branches, the same features could develop.
Right.
The same feature will be 1, but
Right.
you will actually be going from 0 to 1 only.
Right.
So it actually falls, it is part of the.
Okay. So it should be clear. What now is clear to me is if you allow features to be evolved more than once, then there's an explanation for any matrix, but it's a very boring explanation. Does everybody agree with that? That everything happens, gets reinvented from the lower node. The question of what is the most parsimonious tree with that property becomes a more interesting and probably NP-complete type problem. Okay? That would be where I think I stand on this now. Any questions about that? Okay? But so what's interesting? Again, the ultrametric tree gives us a natural reconstruction algorithm idea. Okay? And once again, okay, if the problem is perfect data, we can reconstruct it efficiently. If you allow noise, complications like features being reinvented or coming and going, the issue becomes more dicey. Okay? Any questions about that? Okay? Any questions? So if we generalize it, again, there is a lot of work that goes into algorithms on these things. There are generalizations. The basic state of the problem is something like this. You can generalize it to non-binary characters, as you were concerned with. Okay? There's a distinction in complexity between ordered worlds. Like, let's say you go from original, if there's a sequence that you go from the initial state did not have this property, it evolved the first trait, then it evolved in the case of, let's say, like a feature like locomotion, you could imagine that you were fixed, like a tree is fixed, a snake is crawling, a lizard is crawling, and we are walking, right? If it is the case that you had to have evolved crawling before you evolved walking, then we would say that the trait is an ordered trait, right? And the different algorithms, depending upon whether the traits are ordered or not. Bottom line, there are issues here, and most of the variants that become interesting rapidly become hard. That, I guess, is the basic question about it. Any questions about that? Okay. So what else? What other approaches might we use to try to reconstruct evolutionary trees? Okay. We sort of agree we can start with distance data. We can start from, feature data. Another technique that is kind of interesting is something called quartet puzzling, which is that maybe building the whole tree of life, where they have 100 species, God, you can't think about 100 species. But maybe you could look at a small set of species and build a tree on just these small set of species, okay? And then combine these trees together to get a bigger tree, okay? So let's just think about, if we think about it, if you have 4 species, it becomes a different kind of a problem. So if we think about, let's say, unrooted trees on 4 species, okay? Here we've got human, chimp, gorilla, and orangutan. My claim is that there are 3 different unrooted trees you can build on 4 nodes, okay? Why is that? Well, if it's a binary tree, it's got to have 2 intermediate nodes, okay? We know that human has to sit somewhere in this unrooted tree, right? And note that if you have an unrooted tree with this topology, there is another species that is closer to human than it is to anybody else. Does everybody kind of get that idea? This is sort of saying that human and chimp are closer to each other than they are to gorilla and orangutan. Okay? If we had this kind of a quartet, what kind of a tree might satisfy that as a rooted tree? Maybe it's something like human, chimp, gorilla, orangutan. Does everybody see that kind of a species? In this case, human is closer to chimp, and orangutan is closer to gorilla, right? Does everybody get that idea? And that is an unrooted tree. This unrooted tree could mean that originally the split was human, chimp, something like this, or it could be a split something like this, where the primates originally got together and went their separate ways. The gorillas and orangutan came here. The human and chimp came here. You see that both of these trees have the same unrooted tree on 4 nodes that explains them. Okay? So the rooted trees on 4 nodes, there's 2 rooted trees on 4 nodes that get explained by the same, the same quartet, rooted, unrooted tree quartet. Okay? But if we knew that one of these species was a real outlier, like let's say we had human, gorilla, chimp, and yeast, okay? We know that the rooted tree probably was this one, right? Because here yeast separated from, everything else, right? The common ancestor of yeast and the primates, okay? Clearly the common ancestor of the primates were closer to each other than, yeast split off first, right? So there's kind of this connection between rooted triples, which I think you and I sort of understand, and these unrooted quartets, which are sort of an analogous kind of a thing. Does everybody get that idea? So anyway, in the literature, people talk about quartet puzzling. The question is this. If I give you now, I take a look at a large set, a bunch of sets of 4 species, figure out the ordering among them, can I now put together a tree that satisfies them? Okay, that explains these quartets. Okay? And that seems like an alternate way to get these kind of trees. Any questions about that as a model here? Well, if you do that, they get into a lot of interesting problems. Okay? The first thing that says is, if you have all n to the choose 4 quartets, if the thing is explained by a tree, if you have all the quartets, you can certainly reconstruct one tree and only one tree from that. Actually, if you're clever, you don't need all the quartets. Okay? But the bottom line is, if you have the quartets, that gives you the topology of the tree. The quartets look a little bit like rooted triples. Okay? So the same thing that you say about quartets, basically you can say about rooted triples, to my way of thinking. Like, for example, notice that there are 3 possible rooted triples. If we have human, chimp, and, yeast and gorilla, what are the 3 rooted triples on human, chimp, and gorilla? Okay? I claim that human, well, let's actually, how many labels are there of this tree? I want to claim that the outgroup can either be human, chimp, or gorilla, and the other 2 species have to sit there. Does everybody agree with that? So that's a sign that there are, in fact, 3 rooted triples, just like there are 3 unrooted quartets. So the problem's pretty much similar. Good news, if you have all the triples or the quartets, you're done. Bad news is, if you have any inconsistencies in them, then in fact the tree is not always a consistent tree that can be put back together from them. And you can start to imagine problems like saying, well, what if I give me a tree, give me a bunch of quartets, say give me a tree that explains most of them, okay? That kind of problem gets into an NP-complete kind of problem again. So again, we have a say where if the data is perfect, easy algorithm, once you allow noise in here, the problem becomes a lot more complicated. Any questions about that? Any questions about, quartet shuffling or any of these other, quartet puzzling or any of these other ideas? Okay. There's what time we have? We have a little time left. I'd like to talk about one other idea in. Any questions so far about this? I'd like to talk about one other model of evolutionary data, that reconstruction problem that comes up in analyzing species, which has a particularly cool computer science background and history on it. So I can't resist. I'll skip a couple things to talk about it. There's another, remember, we talked here about data, different kinds of data you might have on species. Okay? And part of what we talked about when we talked about sequence data was the idea that you had the same gene in many species. If you looked at the mutations that had accumulated, again, you might get a distance of which species are closer, which species are further away. There are all kinds of other weird things, though, that happen to genomes over the years, okay, that turn out to be interesting. Every once in a while, in the course of a species evolving, there is a duplication event, okay, where genetic material gets duplicated, okay? So, and usually this is a bad thing. So I think, how many of you have heard of Down syndrome? Okay, Down syndrome is a genetic disease. What causes Down syndrome? It's when you've got an extra copy of a chromosome that you shouldn't have, right? So this is a bad defect, okay? It causes a lot of problems. But of course it doesn't, people can live with, there are people that live with it, okay? But it's an example of the fact that sometimes there can be gross changes in genomic sequence, where there's whole duplications of stuff, okay? And the organism can live and be different, right? Now, usually having a duplication is a bad thing, but sometimes it's a good thing, okay? Maybe if you duplicate a hunk of your genome, okay, you're going to make more of those genes. They'll be overexpressed, and maybe that's a good thing, right? Maybe it'll be a benign thing, But now that you have copies of, two copies of the same gene, evolution can work on one of them and evolve a new function for a protein that it didn't have. So on the macro scale of evolution, a lot of what happens is not little point changes, okay, that cause a big difference. It's that there are these big, large-scale genome rearrangement events. Hunks get duplicated, or hunks get reversed, okay? And an interesting phylogenic problem, or evolutionary problem to try to reconstruct, is to figure out what the history of these events are, okay? Does this kind of start to make sense? If, in fact, you have a bunch of species where, at the beginning, there was an ancestral species, and in the course of, sometimes what has caused a split may have been a whole genome duplication, right? Another thing that happens surprisingly often is that a hunk of a genome might get, through some recombination or some other process, might get reversed. So a genome sequence that had 5 genes on it, where they were in order A, B, C, D, E, might, after the reversal, come out 1, 3, 2, 4, 5. Okay? These are very rare catastrophic events. Usually such a mutation a defect would kill the species. But occasionally it doesn't cause a problem. Maybe it occasionally causes an advantage, right? And if it's an advantage, this population will have a reversal of part of its genome. Okay? Any questions about that? If you believe in these large-scale mutations, you can kind of believe that these things can happen. And if you believe in that, then reconstructing this history of, let's look at it. Let's take a look at it, what I want to say here. If you look at it, then reconstructing the history of these reversals and duplications is important to understanding the evolution between species. Okay? So one interesting study that I'd heard, for example, if you say, what is the difference between humans and mice? Okay, we all agree that there's a difference, right? But the difference is not that mice have different genes, okay? Because basically we have essentially the same set of genes as mice, right? The difference is, to some extent, changes in control regions and small things. But one big difference is that in the 100 million years or so, since there was a common ancestor between humans and mice, there have been on the order of about 200 different genome rearrangements, okay? And that's a sizable part of what is the difference between us and mice, okay? And so one very, very interesting reconstruction problem, or a genome analysis problem, is trying to figure out the history of these events, okay? Any questions? I get the sense I may have gone through this a little fast, but I want to know if people sort of see what the problem is, or any questions with this. So what is the situation? Suppose, let's say, we look at a species. We know that if I can take a look at, here I've got the human genome, here I've got the mouse genome, right? We know that humans and mice have the same set of genes, right? So if we numbered the human genes from 1, 2, 3, in the order in which they appear in the genome, from 1 to 25,000, right? If we look at the mice genome, it's going to have a gene that is first, maybe homologous to our gene 478, 479, 480, 32, 33. Does everybody get this idea? That if we take the genes in human and the genes in mice, okay, there is a certain, every one is homologous to one of the other. You can imagine a world where something like this has happened, right? They've been rearranged over the years. They don't appear in the same order. The question is, can we find the smallest number of evolutionary events, reconstruct the history of evolutionary events, to try to figure out what the order of these mutations were? When was there which sequence of reversals happened before which other reversals? How many reversals did happen over the 100 million years since there was a common ancestor? Any questions about this problem? Is this kind of motivated as a problem? And does so complete the final. Work.